For today's virtual lab, we're going to be focusing on anaerobic power, including how we'll test that. We're going to focus on two primary methods of testing. The first is something called the Wingate test. Many of you, or some of you, may have had the opportunity to participate in a Wingate or maybe see a Wingate test. It's probably the most robust and commonly used method of anaerobic power assessment. And the reason for that is it can give you peak power, it can give you a minimum power assessment, it can give you a fatigue index over the course of 30 seconds. So it's pretty robust. There is some question to its validity, but most agree that it's a pretty solid test to use. Now, part of the problem with anaerobic power, when we're talking about it, when we're considering it, is there's so much variability. It's a lot different than, say, aerobic capacity, which some consider to be the opposite, which it's not really, but some consider it or think about it in that way. Aerobic capacity is very easily measured. There's a very strong relationship between aerobic capacity and aerobic exercise performance. Anaerobic power is so much more difficult to assess. When you're talking about anaerobic, are you talking about something that's done over the course of 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute and a half? Technically, activities for all of those durations are covered through some kind of anaerobic energy pathway, whether it be ATP-PCR or whether it be anaerobic glycolysis. So the range is really wide. Second, it's really difficult to measure anaerobic performance because most sports that involve anaerobic performance rely on a host of factors. There's a lot more covariates which could potentially confound that training and performance relationship. And so the whole question is very convoluted. Now, when you look in the literature at anaerobic exercise performance, it can be difficult to find good solid articles. Again, the reason being is there's so much variability with what anaerobic exercise is and what anaerobic power performance is. People consider it to be different things. And so almost always you have to look at a specific metric like fatigue index or peak power as assessed by the Wingate or another test, and then you have to look at a specific performance characteristic, whether it be a certain amount of weight lifted or a certain time for a given metric. When we're talking about anaerobic exercise performance, in a lot of cases, it's tied in with team-based sports. That's in contrast to aerobic exercise performance, which almost always is an individual sport. So you can use time or some other metric. But with anaerobic exercise performance, if it's tied into team-based sports, how do you judge performance? Would you use a metric like goals scored or runs batted in? As you guys might imagine, having probably followed sport, there's a lot more that goes into an individual metric and whether or not that dictates team-based performance. And so the issue here with anaerobic exercise is it's very, very convoluted. So what we know is that the Wingate test is a pretty good test for this. So we're going to focus a lot of today's lab on that. And that's going to be very difficult for you guys to simulate in our current environment where you may or may not be able to get to a gym right now and try this on the cycle. So you're going to have an opportunity to do a lot of calculations. Today, Cole and I will both simulate the Wingate test, and we'll show you different ways in which you can calculate different anaerobic power metrics. We're also going to focus on the vertical jump, which may sound like an insignificant anaerobic power test, and in some regards it is. It's an explosive test, and so it may be looking at ATP-PCR more than anaerobic glycolysis, but there's actually calculations we can make from that regarding power. And so we'll give you the opportunity to look at that also. And finally, we might show a few tests at the end. There are different agility drills. There's the broad jump. There's a lot of sport-specific anaerobic or power-based tests you can use. But really the Wingate is really the most robust, which comprehensively covers a number of sports, activities, and athletes. So we'll make sure to talk about each of those. Other than that, we hope you enjoyed today's lab. The Wingate test is an all-out 30-second cycling test at extremely high intensity. For those of you that have not seen or participated in a Wingate protocol, I think you'll enjoy it. It's a different kind of test, and the load, as I mentioned, is very high. And the first thing we have to do is calculate that load for each individual that will cycle. The load or resistance is calculated based on what the person's body mass is. And so Cole and I, Cole being subject 1 and I being subject 2, as you can see here, will both participate in the Wingate protocol today. And we have calculated our load, as you can see here, based on our mass. And how that is calculated is 0.075 times their body mass. And that, as we've calculated, gives Cole a load of 7.76 kilograms to cycle against for 30 seconds, and me a load of 7.37 kilograms to cycle against for 30 seconds. Now, in really fantastic exercise physiology labs where funding is not an issue, they might have a really advanced Wingate system using a Velotron or some other advanced cycle and software. Most labs don't have that, and we don't either. But never fear, there's a great protocol we can use with a Monarch cycle or another cycle where we can drop the load or drop the resistance very, very quickly. And so that's what we're going to do today. But because loads can only be dropped in certain increments and not as precise as, say, a Velotron system, we have to sometimes modify that exact load. And so Cole's load will be rounded up to 7.8 kilograms because those are the units we can use for our system. And for me, the load will be 7.4 kilograms. Now, of utmost importance when we're doing the Wingate test is to recognize that these are very high loads. They're very hard to cycle against, starting from not moving at all. And so one of the things we will do before the Wingate cycle assessment begins is the individual, either Cole or I, will begin cycling at a high speed without the load, so that when the load is dropped, we can continue to cycle for the next 30 seconds.
It is important to prepare the body for maximal exertion prior to a Wingate test. Here I'm performing 30-second sprints on an air bike with 30 seconds of rest to increase my heart rate, prepare the muscles to be worked, and generally prepare the body for maximal effort.
We also need to make sure that the bike is at its right height, and this can be tricky to determine, to figure out. Somewhat universally, the consensus is that on the downstroke, that the seat should be high enough so that when we near full leg extension or near leg extension, that there's still some slight bend in the knee. So we'll ask Cole to slow down here for just a minute to show downstroke. Go ahead and freeze on the downstroke there. There's still some bend in the knee. If you've reached full extension where there's no bend in the knee, it's going to be difficult, as he's demonstrating there, it's going to be difficult to generate the kind of power needed. As I mentioned, the Wingate is a 30-second all-out cycling test. But really the Wingate protocol begins about 30 seconds before that. What we need to make sure to do in those first 30 seconds before any assessment begins is that we gradually increase the speed of the cycling. So the participant or subject will be cycling starting from nothing, going faster and faster and faster and faster and faster against no load at all. And that's for the first 30 seconds. The goal being that right about the time when we get to 30 seconds, in other words, when the assessment is going to begin, that the individual is cycling as fast as they can. Because at 30 seconds, or at the beginning of the next 30 seconds, that's when the load will drop. And as I mentioned before, it's a very large load. It's a high resistance. Okay? And then we have 30 seconds of the actual Wingate test. The load has been dropped. Okay? The cyclist or the participant was cycling at a very high intensity or very high speed. The load was dropped, and now we have the 30 seconds of measurement. Okay? Typically, when an individual is doing a Wingate test, the first 10 seconds don't feel too bad. There's a noticeable difference with the load, but it doesn't feel too bad. Then comes the middle 10 seconds, and that's usually when the athlete says, uh-oh, this is kind of hard. And then for most athletes, the last 10 seconds is pretty difficult. depending on the athlete and what their training is. In my experience, if the athlete has done a lot of really high intensity work for periods longer than 15 to 20 seconds, if they're used to doing a lot of HIIT training, for example, the Wingate test is hard, but not critically hard. It's not something that's terrible or incredibly exhausting. Although it is hard for just about anybody that does it. For someone that's maybe an aerobic athlete and only participates in aerobic training, in my experience, this is a pretty hard test because they're unaccustomed to activities of extreme or maximal intensity activity for longer than a few seconds. Likewise, you might get a power-based athlete that's only used to doing increments of 5 to 10 seconds. And for those athletes also, the Wingate test can be pretty difficult because it goes, as I mentioned before, for 30 seconds. Because we don't have a precise Velotron system or another exact or software-generated system, as I mentioned before, we're using our Monarch cycle. And the weight that we put on, we do the best we can. It might not be to the exact kilogram or to the half kilogram, but it's the best we can do, obviously. And so what we need to do to complete our calculations is measure or assess or count the number of revolutions the cyclist is making. And the ones that are most important, the time frames, are the first 5 seconds, the last 5 seconds, and for the entire 30 seconds. And now we are set to begin the Wingate test for participant number 1. The first 30 seconds will be all about getting him to full intensity, and I have not dropped the weight yet. I'm holding it up. Okay, Cole, go ahead and start. You have 30 seconds. See how easily he's cycling right now? There is no load on here. I'm holding that up. 20 seconds, Cole. So start speeding up. Good. About 10 seconds, so start going fast now. There's no load yet. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. 5. Let's go, Cole. Come on, Cole, let's go. He's reached 10 seconds. Come on, Cole, let's go. 10 seconds left. Let's go, Cole. 25. Stop. Immediately we need to take off the resistance because of utmost importance is to get this participant cycling quickly or moving at a very light intensity. Part of the reason for that is what he has done in this time period is accumulated a ton of lactate. I mean, he just upped his lactate accumulation a ton. And right now, there's a lot of lactate in his muscles, which is going to start spilling over into the blood. And one response we commonly see after a Wingate test is a couple minutes afterwards, the athlete feels an intense urge to vomit. It's kind of like binge drinking, honestly. The body has accumulated a lot of stuff very quickly that it feels it needs to get rid of, okay? And so I've actually had athletes in the past that have told me right after the test, oh, I'm fine, I don't feel sick at all. And then within a couple minutes afterwards, they're in the corner throwing up, okay? But that was a great test. How do you feel, Cole?
Good.
How was it? How were the first 10 seconds?
First 10 seconds wasn't too bad.
Middle 10 seconds?
You can see in the video it started to slow down real hard. That last 10 seconds was...
The last 10 seconds is tough, yeah.
I noticed I started to push myself up from the resistance. I don't have enough force to be able to drive down. My butt started to come off the chair.
It's a very, very heavy load. And cycling against that high of a load is something we're not accustomed to. And if we were just to put that load on there right now and have him start cycling against that load from not moving at all, it would be very difficult for him to do. He could do it, but it would be very difficult for him to do. That's why we start at such a high speed before the load even drops.
Starting the test for subject number 2 in 10 seconds. And 5, 3, 2, 1. And go ahead and start pedaling nice and slow. "20 seconds left to start. 15 seconds, we'll pedal a little faster. 10 seconds left. And 5, 3, 2, 1, and go. Let's go, Dr. Come on. 2 more seconds. And 5. Let's go, keep it up. 10 seconds in. Keep it up, come on, keep the power, drive down. Halfway there, let's go, Dr. Connolly, come on. 10 seconds left. Woo. Push it out, come on. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and time. Nice. All right, pulling it off for the cool down. Go ahead and start rotating.
So here you can see the results from our Wingate test for both Cole, who's subject 1, and for me, who's subject 2. In this column, we have revolutions for the first 5 seconds. In the second column here, we have revolutions for the last 5 seconds. And in the third column, we have revolutions for the entire 30 seconds of the test. You will need the numbers or the data from each of these columns and this also, including some of our demographic variables, which will be on your lab report sheet, to make the calculations for absolute peak power, absolute mean power, minimum power, and fatigue index. Okay, so you'll need to be using these numbers for those calculations. And again, those calculations are supplied for you in your lab report. So the first thing we need to get is standing height. Here's how we see the difference between the top vertical jump height and the standing height. So we need to get that first, okay? So what I'm going to ask Cole to do is to put his arm up as high as he can and slowly walk through the vertex here. Okay? Go ahead and move back. So we have that set at 84 inches. We've got 85, 86, 87, 88. 89 inches is Cole's standing height. I'm going to do that one more time. So we just had Cole do it a second time, and now he is at 89.5 inches. So 89.5 inches is Cole's standing height. Okay, so I just did it. My standing height is 95.5 inches. Okay, so for the vertical jump here, many of you have probably already done this, but if you haven't, humor me here, okay? You're not going to take a step beforehand. You're going to start from a base. He's going to crouch down and jump up to the highest possible point that he can, okay? We will do this 2 times at least, usually just 2 times. We'll try to take the average typically. And so whenever you're ready, Cole. Okay, nicely done. So we're starting at 96 inches. So we've got 102, 108, 114, 115, 115.5 would be his jump height. Now that's not his vertical. To find out the vertical, you would need to take the jump height and subtract it by the standing height, and that's how you determine what the vertical jump is. Yep. What did we say it was? 115.5? 20. Wow, that's trials. We have one 15.5 and we have one 18 in inches. And as I mentioned, we'll take the difference for each of those with the standing height. And then we'll take the best jump height difference. And that is your vertical jump. So after doing the vertical jump test for both Cole, who's subject 1, and myself, subject 2, we have our standing height as listed here, and then we have our trial 1 and trial 2 jump heights here. To determine what the vertical jump height then was, the vertical height, then you would take the difference between that and that as indicated in your lab report document.
Here we will watch another athlete perform a broad jump test, which is a horizontal version of the vertical jump test. The athlete stands in place and then leaps forward as far as they can go. So now let's break down the form just a little bit more. Notice here that the athlete is at full triple extension when leaving the ground. And then finally at the apex, or the peak of the jump, the athlete brings their knees to their chest to increase the distance jumped. This is a really complex movement that should be practiced before executing at maximal intensity. As Dr. Connolly previously mentioned, there are some other tests that we can use for anaerobic power, and some may be more sport-specific than others. For example, many football players use agility cones or agility ladders to train agility, footwork, and quickness. These can be reassessed over time to see how someone is developing in those areas. Overall, we want to consider the implications of the movement with regards to translation to performance before testing something for improvements over time.
So this concludes our very brief virtual lab today. I hope you enjoyed seeing the Wingate test, and maybe at some point you'll be able to participate in that if you haven't to this point. This is meant to start to get you to begin thinking about how we assess performance from an aerobic standpoint, and how most of the time that's done in a sport-specific manner. Our next virtual lab, which will take place in a few weeks, in contrast, will look at aerobic capacity testing. There are many, many ways to test aerobic capacity and aerobic fitness, and it's quite a bit more developed than anaerobic power testing. And so that's what we're going to focus on, including submaximal protocols, which you can use to estimate VO2 max and aerobic capacity, and also VO2 max protocols where we actually measure oxygen consumption and we can see where the plateau is with increasing intensity with respect to aerobic capacity. So that's coming in a future lab. So as you're compiling the data and finishing your lab report this week for anaerobic power, maybe start to let your thoughts drift to aerobic capacity and aerobic exercise performance, which is what we're going to talk about in a few weeks. Thanks, guys.